I'm Melina Weisskopf filling in for Steve Lance tonight. President Trump today signed an executive order to bring the cost of prescription drugs in the U.S. down. Our Washington correspondent Luis Martinez has more on this story.
Today, Americans spend 70% more for prescription drugs than we spent in the year 2000. Starting today, the United States will no longer subsidize the health care of foreign countries.
Despite having just 4% of the world's population, the United States market makes up for 2/3 of the profits earned by pharmaceutical companies through sales worldwide. The president's executive order does not target pharmaceuticals, but it does demand a most favored nation status for the United States to access prescription drugs at lower prices.
It's just a redistribution of wealth. It's a redistribution where it could be the same top line, but it's going to be distributed differently. Europe's going to have to pay a little bit more. The rest of the world's going to have to pay a little bit more, and America's going to pay a lot less.
According to the Trump administration, European Union nations pay a fraction of the prices that the United States pays for the same medications.
One breast cancer drug costs Americans over $16,000 per bottle, but the same drug from the same factory, manufactured by the same company, is 1/6 that price in Australia and 1/10 that price in Sweden.
Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. noted that lowering prescription drug prices was a hallmark proposal of prominent Democratic leaders like Senator Bernie Sanders during his 2020 presidential campaign.
Congress is controlled in so many ways by the pharmaceutical industry. There's at least one pharmaceutical lobbyist for every congressman, every senator in Capitol Hill, and every member of the Supreme Court. By some estimates, 3.
President Trump signed a similar executive order during his first term in office to have Medicare have access to prescription drugs at lower prices. The executive order was halted by a federal court.
This means American patients were effectively subsidizing socialist healthcare systems in Germany, in all parts of the European Union.
This Monday's executive order will likely be challenged in courts. It remains to be seen whether congressional Republicans will move ahead and codify the president's initiative. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
As the U.S. and China agree to lower tariffs temporarily, President Trump touts a reset with Beijing while warning he could ramp up tariffs further if the deal doesn't materialize. NTD's White House correspondent Iris Tao has more.
We achieved a total reset with China.
In calling it a total reset, President Trump touts a breakthrough as the U.S. and China agreed to lower tariffs and continue talks. For the next 90 days, U.S. tariffs on China will go down from 145% to 30%, and China will also cut its tariffs on U.S. goods from 125% to now 10%. And President Trump says China also agreed to remove non-monetary trade barriers and open up to American markets.
Think about it. We opened up our country to China. They have very few restrictions, and they didn't open their country to us. Never made sense to me. It's not fair. And they've agreed to open China, fully open China.
The latest agreement comes after a month of escalation in which the U.S. and China hiked tariffs on each other and had no official talks until the past weekend. Secretary Scott Bessent, after meeting with Chinese officials in Switzerland, says talks will continue as the administration seeks to balance out the massive trade deficit with China.
There will also be a possibility of purchase agreements to pull what is our largest bilateral trade deficit into balance.
That said, the deal is not finalized, and President Trump says that if they fail to reach a final deal on paper, which could take a while, tariffs will go up on China substantially.
But they would go up substantially higher.
There are also exceptions to the tariffs cuts, especially in critical industries.
And it doesn't include tariffs on cars, steel, aluminum, things such as that.
Reporting by Iris Tao, NTD News.
Trump's trade deal with China keeps the 20% tariff to pressure the CCP to stop the flow of fentanyl into the U.S. So how will the U.S. measure China's efforts to keep their agreement? To discuss these developments, we welcome Thomas Duesterberg. He's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. All right, Thomas, thank you for joining the show tonight. So let's first talk about tariffs. President Trump says that China will open itself up to U.S. goods. Let's together listen to a clip from the president today speaking about his efforts here.
Because if you think about it, we opened up our country to China. They have very few restrictions. and they didn't open their country to us. Never made sense to me. It's not fair. And they've agreed to open China, fully open China. And I think it's going to be fantastic for China. I think it's going to be fantastic for us.
Thomas, can you explain for us what Trump is describing here? What would it look like to fully open up China, and what would it mean for American businesses?
Well, I certainly hope the president is right, but we've been trying this for about 30 years. And China, when it joined the World Trade Organization about 25 years ago, said that it was going to be fully open, but it never was, and it isn't now. China uses a variety of mechanisms to keep American companies, and not just American companies, from prospering in the Chinese market. Most of these are not tariff related, but some of them are. They just don't make it easy for companies to operate there. And so by the time they let American companies in, China has already mastered the technology or the cost effectiveness of their competitive goods. And so it's been impossible to really prosper in the Chinese market. So hopefully this agreement is real, but it's going to take a lot of change in the Chinese economy and their attitude towards outside competitors for this really to be an effective mechanism.
Let's listen together at what the director of the White House's Economic Council, Kevin Hassett, had to say about this.
We actually have a fresh start with China. That's the way to think about these negotiations, that we've come in with these reciprocal tariffs. We've described the non-tariff barriers and tariffs that disadvantage American workers, and folks are coming to the table, and it's really stunning how quickly they're moving and how dramatic the changes are.
How long could this process take until we officially see this impact play out here at home?
It could take a while because China has made these promises before. And in order for these more effective participation in the Chinese market, like Kevin has indicated here, it's going to take major changes in the way the Chinese economy works. They are an export-oriented economy. They overproduce goods, like they produce enough cars to export 50% of them, which was about 10 million a year, to outside buyers, like in the United States. They did the same thing with solar tariffs, and with windmills, with steel. So they have to be willing to not only accept American companies and American exports, but they have to be willing to let their companies, to ratchet back their companies' production capacity, because the world just can't absorb everything that China produces. And the growth model that the Chinese have depends heavily on exports. So they're going to have to figure out a way to keep their economy prosperous and growing without relying on exports. And that's going to take some time.
Trump says that certain tariffs will still be in place. Here's the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent explaining the situation.
Neither side wants a generalized decoupling. The U.S. is going to do a strategic decoupling in terms of the items that we discovered during COVID were of national security interest, whether it's semiconductors, medicines, steel. So we still have generalized tariffs on some of those.
Now, the administration has identified certain vulnerable areas, but is there a risk that China could gradually take over production in any industry and turn it into a national security concern here?
Well, the areas that the Treasury Secretary pointed out, semiconductors, advanced medical products, and a few others, China could do that. They don't have the technology yet to be dominant in those markets. But that's why we're going to keep higher tariffs on those. But it's also for the reason that our national security requires that we not be dependent on China, because in part China has demonstrated in the past and will probably continue in the future to use its domination of certain markets like it does now to put pressure on the United States and undermine the U.S. economy. So that's the part where we will continue to have tariffs in order to prevent the Chinese from dominating anything that's related in a major way to our national security and our technology leadership in high technology goods like semiconductors and artificial intelligence. Those areas are going to be off limits for China to really try to undermine our markets.
Now, Thomas, one tariff that the U.S. imposed on China was 20% across the board. This is over the regime's role in the fentanyl crisis. Let's listen to what Trump said about the issue.
I'd like to go back to China just for a second. They're very heavy on the fentanyl. We're charging them, as you know, 20% for the fact that they send fentanyl into our country. And they've agreed that they're going to stop that. And, you know, they'll be rewarded by not having to pay, you know, hundreds of billions of dollars in tariffs.
Thomas, what kind of standard do you think that U.S. officials should use to measure whether China is taking any action to stop the fentanyl crisis here in the U.S.?
Well, we can probably measure somewhat effectively how much fentanyl is coming into the country. Unfortunately, one of the measures is how many people are dying in this country. But China's involvement in producing fentanyl or producing the products that they send to Mexico to be turned into fentanyl is a major one. But it's not the only way they participate in that market. With illicit drugs, you generate a huge amount of cash. And in order to put that cash to work in U.S. dollars and get it back to China, you have to engage in money laundering. And the Chinese banks are complicit in that. And it's not just to the United States. They handle the money laundering for the drug trade pretty much throughout the world. So we're going to have to be vigilant and watch the activities in banks with cash transactions. And we're probably going to have to make sure that all of that cash that they're producing, not only in the United States, but in Europe and other advanced countries, how that gets back to China. And if they're not cutting off that money laundering, then we know that they're still complicit in the fentanyl trade. So those are really major questions that have to be answered.
All right, Thomas, thank you so much for your insights and breaking all this down for us today. It's great to have you on the show.
Okay, thank you, Melina, for having me.
And now moving on to overseas. After more than a year and a half in Hamas captivity, Israeli-American Edan Alexander is free. This comes as President Trump heads to the Middle East. NTD's Washington correspondent Jack Bradley has the details.
Edan Alexander, an American citizen who, until recently, most thought was no longer living, thought was dead, is going to be released in about 2 hours.
Edan Alexander is the last known living American hostage in Gaza to be released. The 21-year-old from New Jersey was serving in the Israeli military when he was captured outside of Gaza on October 7th, 2023. Monday's release was the result of indirect negotiations between the U.S. and Hamas, and these were led by Special Envoy Steve Witkoff.
Before the eyes of Steve Witkoff, who has done a fantastic job.
Trump also said the move was a step in good faith by the mediators, Egypt and Qatar. Negotiations are ongoing in Qatar to release the remaining 58 hostages, including the bodies of 4 other Americans. Meanwhile, President Trump is heading to the Middle East to meet first with leaders in Saudi Arabia on Tuesday morning. Between then and Friday, he'll be in Qatar and then the UAE. He's expected to discuss important regional issues like the Israel-Hamas war and ongoing nuclear talks with Iran. But the main announcement will be investment deals from these countries in U.S. technology, AI, and defense. Saudi Arabia recently pledged to invest $600 billion over the next 4 years into the United States. The UAE committed $1.4 trillion in U.S. manufacturing, energy, and technology over the next decade. And on top of that, major U.S. weapon sales to Saudi Arabia and Qatar are taking place. And Trump says Qatar is gifting the U.S. a 747 aircraft to replace the current Air Force One, which is now 40 years old. And regarding Thursday's expected peace talks between Russia and Ukraine and Turkey, Trump said he might take a detour during his trip to attend if he thinks it's helpful.
I don't know where I'm going to be at that particular point. I'll be someplace in the Middle East, but I would fly there if I thought it would be helpful.
This is President Trump's first major foreign trip of his second term, following a recent visit to the Vatican for Pope Francis's funeral about 2 weeks ago. During his first term, Trump also chose the Middle East for his first foreign trip. But at that time, he also visited Israel. But Trump did meet with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House twice since Trump's second term. Reporting by Jack Bradley, NTD News.
Dozens of South Africans today arriving in the U.S. under a refugee resettlement program initiated by President Trump. The State Department says the group faces state-sponsored racial discrimination in their home country. A plane carrying 49 people, mostly farmers, landed at Washington Dulles International Airport earlier this morning. The group fled due to a South African law that allows the government to take private land for public use, sometimes without compensation. President Trump says the measure would be leveraged against the white Afrikaner minority, who currently owns roughly 2/3 of farmland in the country. Back in February, Trump signed an executive order seeking to resettle Afrikaner refugees who face, quote, racially discriminatory property confiscation. South Africa denies the allegation.
Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.